Thank you and welcome everyone. Time's 3 p.m. Eastern, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar from CompetencyWorks. The title of today's webinar is to provide an introduction to K-12 competency-based education. And this is hosted by iNACOL CompetencyWorks, and I'd like to thank our partners at CompetencyWorks as well. CompetencyWorks.org is a website to provide an online resource for K-12 competency-based education. And we have more than 30 reports published there, as well as a blog on current topics and issues, learning from the leading edge of the field of competency-based education. You can also access resources on reports on tough issues like why competency-based grading is important. So today, we'll begin the webinar. I'd just like to point you in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. There is a chat room. You can put your cursor in that white box and introduce yourself, say where you're from and your interest in competency-based education. We have quite a few attendees on this webinar, and we're hoping that you type in questions. Feel free to make comments. If you had ideas to add during the presentation, please know this webinar is recorded and will be archived and available to you after the webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm facilitating today. I'm Susan Patrick, the President and CEO for iNACOL. And joining me is the new project leader for CompetencyWorks, Eliot Levine, who's the research director at iNACOL. And we're so pleased today to have Dr. Pamela Swanson, who's the superintendent for Westminster School District in Colorado. Westminster and Dr. Swanson have been leading the field in competency-based education for more than a decade and have a district-wide implementation. It's such an honor to have her with us today, and we're pleased that she will be presenting. Some of the big high-level questions we'll be addressing in today's webinar is, what is competency-based education? Why do we need to change the system of learning that we're so accustomed today in traditional education? How competency-based education is advancing across the United States? What's the relationship between competency-based ed and personalized learning? What kinds of policy levers are helpful to catalyze competency-based ed, and what resources are available to guide this transformation? Again, please feel free to put your questions in the chat room, and we will actively be addressing them. There will also be a time for Q&A at the very end. So in getting started, I would like to this working definition was created in 2011 with iNACOL in partnership with the Council for Chief State School Officers, CCSSO, with a group of 100 innovators and educators working in competency-based education. So this definition is a working definition, and we call it competency-based education, but we understand in the field, depending on your state or your region, it can be called different things. Mastery-based education, proficiency-based education, performance-based education, and of course, competency education. But in this definition, it's really important to mean what you say, and these 5 common elements were developed to help build the field and develop shared understanding of what we mean when we're talking about competency-based education. And number 1, all 5 of these elements are important for the definition. The first is that students advance upon demonstrated mastery. They are showing what they know for mastery before advancing. Number 2, that competencies are clear, explicit, measurable, and transferable learning objectives that empower students. They know their goals. Number 3, that assessment is meaningful and a positive learning experience for students. They know if they're not yet proficient or whether they've achieved proficiency or have advanced on mastery. Number 4, that students are getting immediate support when they need it. If they're not yet proficient, they are getting supports right away to help meet their individual learning needs. And number 5, the learning outcomes emphasize the broader creation of knowledge and development of skills, habits of success, and important dispositions. So there is a broader definition of success in this competency-based system that we are describing, and this is a very student-focused definition. So in the United States, how is competency-based education advancing? Well, since we began CompetencyWorks in 2012, our nonprofit has been mapping the developments in schools and districts across the U.S., and we estimate that 8 to 10% of public school districts are actively planning, preparing, piloting, or starting to implement competency-based education. In state policy, back in 2012, 7 years ago, you can see that there were more than a handful of states that had started to create flexibility from seat time or seat time waivers. And some states were doing more advanced work by creating competency-based pilots, deeper alignment across state policy and regulations in support of moving to a competency-based system. Look, by 2018, you have 43 states advancing policy. So if you go back and forth, you can see the development in just 6 years to the expansion in state policy to allow for and support competency-based education. And we'll be updating this map soon. There are even more states doing the work now in 2019. So what is the reason behind this move from our traditional system as we know it towards competency-based ed? Well, fundamentally, this is about making change for equity. If we think about the very basic idea of a mastery-based education, that you must demonstrate mastery to move to the next assignment or move to the next level, that right now in a traditional system, we're allowing students to move through with some pretty significant gaps. Part of this are traditional grading policies. Even students with a B, with an 80%, have a 20% gap in their learning. What competency-based education does is ensure that all students get the knowledge and skills they need before moving ahead. And why do we allow a student to move through an entire course load for a year and then have one of those courses require credit recovery? Wouldn't it be better to focus on unit recovery as a competency-based system does, so that students are getting what they need? That's part equity, and it's absolutely about growth mindset and making sure that all students learn. In addition, when students are given the opportunity for deeper learning across the competency-based progression, that means that kids aren't sorted out in terms of those that have those deeper learning experience and those that don't, but that every student is getting opportunities for deeper learning across their continuum. Competency-based structures help create more personalized learning opportunities for how you learn, when you learn, and where you learn. And in terms of global competitiveness, there have been quite a significant amount of work done in leading global education systems around the world in mapping out the competencies and skills needed. There are reports published by OECD. And so this shift is absolutely essential for our own global competitiveness. We'll follow up and go more in terms of identifying and addressing some of the flaws of the traditional system, which moving your system and that change to a competency-based system helps bridge from where we are now to where we need to go to ensure that all students can learn by addressing these flaws one by one, which is a huge list, but there are many reasons that districts, schools, and educators are turning to competency-based education. So Eliot, I'll turn it over to you to talk through what the research is showing us the major flaws are with the traditional system. Thanks. Eliot?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for joining us. So it really helps to understand the competency-based education if we start by talking about some flaws of the traditional model, which is still mostly in place in most American schools. It was developed at a very different time in history, and it wasn't designed to ensure that all students could be prepared with the full set of skills they'd need for their future. So first, the traditional system focuses on a narrow set of mostly academic outcomes, and we'll see how a competency-based system focuses on a broader set of outcomes. Second, the traditional system is based on a fixed mindset, which assumes that not all students have strong learning potential, and that mindset can, of course, hurt student outcomes. The traditional system also tends to be very bureaucratic and hierarchical and organized around compliance, which makes it hard for teachers to personalize what they do to the needs of individual students. The traditional system also has high levels of variability in terms of what level of learning is considered proficient. Certain teachers and certain schools have higher expectations for students than others, and those differences create inequities. The opaque learning objectives and performance expectations of the traditional model mean that students often don't really know what they're supposed to be learning. For example, if a student gets a low grade on a paper, it's often unclear to them what they need to do differently to get a higher grade. You can see the issue of grading practices with mixed messages and misleading signals if you think about students who get high grades in high school but then need to do remedial coursework in college. And those students have often been misled about their actual level of mastery. In many cases, that's because their grades in academic subjects have been inflated due to their good behavior or their strong participation in class. The traditional system is time-based, with students often advancing to the next level as long as they've spent a year in a class, even if they haven't mastered the material. Or in many cases, students need to keep taking the course through the end of the year, even after they've already mastered the material. Next, grading systems that depend heavily on extrinsic motivation are often driven by needing to earn a certain average number of points on assessments, and that does work well for some students, but it can be very problematic for students who are less driven or who receive zeros on certain assignments, which can be pretty much impossible to recover from in the traditional grading system. Another flaw of the traditional system is that extra supports are mostly targeted to students whose needs are well above or below the norm, and these could be students who are failing or who qualify for gifted and talented programs, but the students in the middle typically don't get those supports. And finally, the traditional system emphasizes summative assessments of what students know, but it doesn't give enough attention to formative assessments that help students move forward in their learning. And also, students often have to take summative assessments even when they clearly aren't ready. Before we talk about what competency-based education is, let's take a minute to discuss what it isn't. First of all, it's not just one or two teachers making a shift typically. We really believe that it needs to be a larger structural change, although we do also know that different schools shift in very different ways, and there's no one exact right way. Also, competency-based education is not simply an online digital curriculum with students progressing at their own pace. That's a common misconception. Competency-based education is a much more comprehensive change than that. And it's also not just moving quickly through a checklist of activities at shallow levels. It's about demonstrating deeper learning and the ability to apply what you've learned. So there are 10 distinguishing features of competency-based education, and we think about them in three main categories. We'll start with purpose and culture. Competency-based education focuses on a broader set of outcomes that prepare students for college, career, and lifelong learning. In addition to academic outcomes, these include transferable skills, which involve applying your knowledge, and also lifelong learning skills, which students need to manage their learning, such as social and emotional skills, perseverance, time management, and others. Competency-based districts and schools make a commitment to be responsible for all students mastering learning expectations. They make a decision that they're going to keep on growing and innovating until every student is learning. And districts and schools nurture empowering, inclusive cultures of learning. This means that they're less bureaucratic and more responsive. They make sure that all students and adults feel that they belong and are valued. And having that type of culture is rooted in the learning sciences, which show that a more responsive and inclusive environment helps students and adults feel that they can take risks to improve their learning. Now, when we talk about pedagogy, it's important to note that there's not one single prescribed learning approach for competency-based education. The main goal is to use what's going to work for students. But there are some things that you'll see in high-quality settings. The first is that all students receive timely and differentiated instruction, and support, not just the students who are most challenged or most advanced. And that's typically done by providing some type of flex time when students can go and work with the teachers they need to get help from, or when teachers can sign up specific students to work with. And that reduces the amount of time that students spend being stalled and not making progress. Second, competency-based schools are committed to pedagogy that's informed by the learning sciences. That means meeting students where they are, which helps them build intrinsic motivation by providing learning that's at the right level for them. It also means recognizing when there are gaps and addressing them quickly so the students don't keep falling further behind and getting demoralized and disengaged. And third, assessments are embedded in a personalized learning cycle and aligned to the broader set of learning outcomes mentioned earlier, including transferable skills and personal success skills. It also includes more emphasis on formative assessment and also performance-based assessments where students apply what they've learned. And finally, there are some structural pieces that are changes from the traditional system. The first is that there are mechanisms in place to increase consistency across teachers in a school about what constitutes mastery of different competencies by actually looking at student work together. And these are called moderation and calibration processes. Another feature is transparent expectations of what students should learn, what proficiency looks like, and how each student is progressing. And transparency is essential for students to be able to take ownership of their learning, and also for adults to be able to see what's working and what support students need. Next are strategies for communicating progress that support learning and success. And this is really about grading and reducing the emphasis on summative assessments and increasing the emphasis on formative assessments, and communicating clearly how a student is progressing and what supports they need to move forward. It's important to note that competency-based schools do use summative assessments, but they're used in a balanced way along with other important forms of assessment. Finally, learners advance when they demonstrate mastery, rather than based on how much time they spent in a class. And the pathways are personalized depending on the student's needs and preferences, which might mean taking more or less time, or needing different supports, or demonstrating mastery in different ways. So that's a very quick overview, and we could discuss each of these issues in detail if we had more time, So later in the webinar, we'll point you to some resources that do provide much more detail. And now I'll turn it back to Susan to discuss the relationship between competency-based education and personalized learning.
Thanks, Eliot, and great questions coming in. We are keeping track of them and cognizant that Dr. Swanson will also be presenting and touching on some of these. So we'll come back around to these questions during the Q&A. So in the field, there is sometimes some confusion around the language. And the language is important because being clear about what we mean by competency-based education and personalized learning and how these ideas are connected, but also how these two ideas are different, becomes very important for the quality of your implementations. So let's take a look. This is a field-developed definition for more than 1,000 educators working in personalized learning. If you think about personalized learning, it is really about per person, per student, per individual, being able to be held to the highest standards for all students, so common standards for all, but each student is having their learning tailored for their strengths, needs, and interests, including enabling student voice and choice in what, how, when, and where they learn to provide flexibility and support to ensure mastery, there's the connection with competency and mastery, of the highest standards possible. So this is an important definition, and Chris Sturgis, my colleague, developed this graphic about how personalization and competency-based education go hand in hand. If you think about competency-based education as a foundation, here it's the tree trunk and the roots for a system that holds all students to the same high expectations and is ensuring mastery of all mastery with transparency and reporting how each student is doing along their pathway, allowing those deeper learning opportunities. And if you think of personalization, using the definition we just talked about as per person, that once you have this map of knowledge and skills needed in a competency-based system, then it becomes really important to offer voice and choice for students in how they learn, learning inside and outside of school, being able to do exhibitions, work-based internships, and being able to bring the learning, no matter where it happens, inside of school or outside of school, against the learning targets and goals, and be able to get essentially credit for that based on demonstrated mastery. So without a competency-based structure, personalization may result in variable achievement. It may actually be an equity issue. Competency-based education is really important for ensuring all students learn to the highest levels. And without personalization, meeting kids where they are, giving them culturally relevant and responsive pathways, it is unlikely that all students will reach these high outcomes. So there is definitely a connection and a relationship, but they are not the same idea. And you might think of personalized learning approaches, more of a modern, contemporary, pedagogical approach, while competency-based education is a system that can help foster and grow personalized approaches with a focus on what we probably haven't said enough, but on student agency and building that agency. So what policies, if we move back from practice, back to state policies, are needed to catalyze competency-based education? And real briefly, here's what we've seen in states. As you start to have more districts and more schools, educators are designing competency-based education from the ground up, then states are creating innovation zones where districts can opt in and flag policy barriers in state code and regulation and in policies that states create more space for. They look at giving waivers or removing some of the outdated, sometimes decades-old traditional policies. States just getting started will create task forces for competency-based education, like legislative task forces, to provide recommendations for how the state can move forward. States are moving away from seat time, offering flexibility in credit. So seat time hours can define a credit, or you can also define credits based on competencies. They're creating pilot programs, like in Idaho and other states, and offering multiple pathways to graduation. States moving forward are examining next-gen models of assessments like New Hampshire PACE, and there are state initiatives to build local capacity in professional learning communities. Some states are trying to take a comprehensive approach while doing multiple of these drivers and levers, so state leadership is advancing. So those of you that are interested in state policy, we do have a Center for Policy. We'd be happy to follow up with you and to help your state or help your community talk to your state policymakers about what you need. And with that, please let me turn it over to Dr. Pamela Swanson, Superintendent of Westminster Public Schools. Pam.
Well, hello everyone. I'm so pleased to join you today, and I always jump at the chance to talk to fellow educators who are interested in competency-based education and personalized learning. Over the past decade, the movement has really picked up steam, which has been critical. I think back to when we started our district-wide competency-based system, we really felt like we were in uncharted territory. So just so we're all on the same page, let me begin by telling you what we mean in Westminster Public Schools by our competency-based system. I have a short video that explains what we're doing in Westminster. So right now what we're going to do is pause for just a few minutes, and I'm going to ask you to go to the group chat on your lower left and click the link, and then we'll be back. Are you watching? Is it coming up? You better not. Text Claudette and see if she can click on it. Here's my one job. I did 5, so we'll check it. What's there? Did you get a text from Claudette? Who else is on there from W? Somebody is there. All right. What are they saying? You're asking questions, right? They're what?
Beginner questions.
Well, that's what this is for. They're looking at it? Yeah, she's got it up. Also, it took her about the time. No, she was at 2. 2:09. Yeah. Okay. Just give me the word when you think I need to say. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Okay, I know everyone probably clicked on that a second or two apart, but we're going to go ahead and start back up. And I guess the obvious question is, why would a school district do this? Well, my team and I can pinpoint the exact moment when we turned to each other and said, this traditional model is just not working. We were all in a room, we were looking at student data, and we were looking at individualized student data, and it was an incredibly sobering moment. And we could see that out of about 10,000 students, a significant number were 2 or more years behind grade level, and everyone was still working hard in the system, but it became clear that while our students and community had dramatically changed over time, our instructional model had not. So for a variety of reasons, many students were coming into our schools behind their peers, and they were just never catching up. Our demographics certainly contributed to our challenges. About 80% of our students were living at poverty level, and about half our students were English language learners. And that was never an excuse we used. It's just a description, but it was our reality. The vast majority of our students were still getting a diploma simply because they showed up for 12 years, raised their hands during attendance, and didn't get into trouble. And like most other districts, we wished these students well, watched them walk off the graduation stage, and when the state released its on-time 4-year graduation rate, they would be counted as a success story. So we knew we had a real problem, and tinkering around the edges would not work. And those of you with long memories who have followed competency-based education may remember that we made a splash a decade ago when we became the largest district in the country to jump in with both feet. And we received a lot of national and local press, and educators across the country said things like, it's about time. This is what we need. And while that was all very exciting, the truth is we were not ready for all that attention. In reality, that splash was more like a tidal wave. It didn't wipe us out, but it came pretty darn close. And because of that narrow escape, I'm a big believer in being honest and telling the good, the bad, and the ugly of our CBS journey. And specifically, 3 mistakes really stood out for us. After piloting CBS at one elementary school in 2008, we rolled it out into all of our elementary and middle schools in the fall of 2009 with a plan to phase it into the high school the following year, 1 grade level at a time. The lesson we learned is that it would have been easier to implement all at once rather than having some kids in a new system while others remained in the traditional one. And because we were so determined to break the mindset of traditional grade level equivalency, we originally set up 10 learning levels to be completed between kindergarten and graduation, traditionally 12 years. And in theory, it made sense, but what we failed to realize was that to non-educators, it was awfully confusing. We strayed too far from what parents understood. Bad idea number 3 was not fully realizing the resistance we would face from the status quo education establishment, including our own Colorado Department of Education that insisted on measuring our success using the state accountability model. It is built around once-a-year high-stakes testing when we as a district were stressing the importance of comprehension and mastery at a point in time and doing point-in-time testing with immediate results. One newspaper reporter called it our David versus Goliath challenge. A big part of the reason we survived was because of our Westminster learning model. It helped us keep our head above water, kind of like a life preserver. The first part of that is moral purpose. Prepare students for the day after graduation. Honor diversity. Nurture the love of learning and serve as a leader in the field. And competency-based design, the how-to, the mechanics, having well-defined standards, aligned assessments, an instructional model, a reporting and recording system, and of course, scheduling. Another component was students and kids first, student agency and engagement, personalized instruction, classroom shared vision and code of conduct, students set their own goals and monitor their learning, having students as partners in the teaching learning cycle. And then another component was plan, do, check, and adjust. That's about strategic planning, aligning all of our district policies, unified improvement plans, progress monitoring cycles, the list goes on and on. And then the other component was about leadership. Leadership matters at all levels. Students, parents, teachers, administrators, our school board and community. Relationships count. And I can tell you that a big reason why we went down this path, I didn't say it explicitly in my opening remarks, but it had to do with equity and access for all students. So what did all that hard work get us? Well, over the past decade, we made steady, consistent academic progress. And in spite of once-a-year high-stakes testing, in spite of that, we were still able to show academic growth. And we have hard data now to back that up, and we moved off the state accountability clock entirely. The side-by-side before and after slide is pretty striking. The colors tell the story. Red is not good, green is very good. Where we once had 7 schools identified as turnaround, we now have none. And as you can see, we had quite a celebration, probably one of the greatest moments in my professional career. We brought all the staff together from across the district. And one other note, in years past, we were very close to getting off the clock, so to be able to have us go over the line was really an exciting time for us. At the same time, our district had received some one-time money from a favorable tax ruling, so our school board also took a courageous step and incentivized all of our employees with money and stipends if we were able to, in spite of the high-stakes testing at the state level that doesn't align with our system, move off that accountability clock. So proof that leadership matters is sometimes rewarded. In December, our Colorado Association of School Boards honored our board as Board of the Year. And by the way, every member of our board is a graduate of the school district. And any of the 5 can talk about our competency-based system and do so often. Our community definitely responded. I really believe we hit a tipping point after years of hard work and heavy lifting. And this past November, we passed our first mill levy override in 16 years. That is allowing us to move our starting teacher salary to $50,000 a year, and one of the highest rates in the state. What has been gratifying and enormously helpful during the past decade has been our many partnerships, some of which we had going in and others we developed over time. Advanced Ed has served as our accountability partner and gave us their full accreditation about 3 years ago for our entire system. It was enormously helpful to be able to bring Advanced Ed to the table and emphasize that they were able to bring a level of scrutiny and assistance to us to tell us if our system was working. Dr. Robert Marzano has been with us every step of the way from the beginning in an advisory capacity. And he provided that stamp of legitimacy for us in the early days when the work was just so hard. That was extremely important. And to non-educators in Colorado, I always described him as the John Elway of public education, which kind of drove home the point that he's a big deal. And this year, Bob upped his commitment to us by opening just the 2nd Marzano Academy in the country in our district. It's designed around competency-based education and also a commitment to building a whole child who contributes to his or her community. And I'll also add that he has done the individual training of all of our staff, and that brings us to really where we are today in WPS. He will be, along with our Susan Patrick, who's here on this webinar, with us in October. And if you're interested, it'll be our 2nd annual summit coming up here in Westminster, and you can register at wpssummit.co. And so we're so pleased, like I said, to be a part of this webinar. And at this time, I'm going to hand it back to Eliot to share some competency-based education resources with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swanson. That was really inspirational, and it's so important for us all to hear about how districts have really launched into this work with great results, and we really admire and appreciate all the work that you and your entire district are doing in Westminster. So thank you again. Before we move into the Q&A period, we want to briefly share some of the many resources that are available to support your transformation to competency-based education. There's the iNACOL website, and the link is in the chat box, which has a wide range of publications and other resources, some of which Susan mentioned at the beginning. There's CompetencyWorks, which is part of iNACOL, which also develops blogs and reports, and which has a wiki with many practical resources. And on CompetencyWorks, we also write about the many other organizations that are also doing great work in this area and the resources that they've developed. You can go to both of the websites, iNACOL.org and competencyworks.org, and sign up for newsletters to get updates on new resources from iNACOL. And finally, we host events such as the webinar that's listed at the top here, and we have a series of other webinars coming up which will be announced soon on the website. And every year we host the iNACOL Symposium, a conference where thousands of practitioners and policymakers and researchers get together in about 200 different sessions to advance this work. So we hope you'll join us there this October. And now I'll turn it back to Susan to lead our Q&A period.
Thank you, and thank you again, Dr. Swanson, for that terrific presentation and video also. And Eliot, thank you. Just a note for everyone, this webinar is recorded. We will be sending you in an email. The archive link in the slides will also be sent to you. So let me go back to Lence's first question, that assuming that time-based is easier logistically, I'd imagine, what does competency-based ed look like in practice from a logistics standpoint? And I sent around a link to one of these many reports on competencyworks.org on lessons learned from K-12 implementers. I will just sort of kick off the answer before turning it over to Dr. Swanson. So how does CBE look like in practice? You touched on some of this, but in the logistics, in some of the schools, we see some best practices like each student having a personalized learning plan and a learner profile. You showed us an example of this in Educate. I've also seen like capacity matrices with students really taking agency and knowing specifically where they are in time, with like really clear learning continuums or learning trajectories or pathways laid out, and students having time-based, basically, there are time-based targets. So there's something that happened from a logistics standpoint in terms of scheduling. You mentioned I've seen schools adapt their schedules so that there's more block time for extra work in areas. What would you describe as some of the ways that you move from a time-based to a competency-based system? The logistics have to change, and when you start giving students and teachers more agency around knowing their learning goals and targets, sometimes some efficiencies arise from that. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about the logistical side.
Yeah, great question. And that is a really meaty question, as you have laid out there for us, Susan. Scheduling is a big deal, even in our elementary schools. In fact, many of our elementary schedules look more like a traditional secondary schedule. We have kids who move in and out of levels in a very fluid way all through the year. And in fact, our recording and reporting system, Empower, it actually has student data at a very granular level in it, so we can see exactly the learning targets that students need to work on, and teachers actually monitor that and update that weekly. Every Wednesday, in fact, is the day. So our parents can be informed, our students can be informed. And so as students move through levels, they often have leveling up assemblies and awards that way, if you will. So it's always interesting when people start talking about the fact that the competency-based system here does not have grade levels. What we have are grade level equivalent expectations in our performance levels, but we have kids grouped in ways so that they can move flexibly throughout the year depending on when they level up and demonstrate mastery. So that happens in each content area. We also have something that we implemented, I believe, a year or so ago called a competency tracker. And when students enter our system, parents now have access to this, and we actually sit down and talk to parents about what year they would like to see their students graduate. Because depending on how students are progressing, leveling up, or accelerating, we also have early graduates as well, that's important. So our communication is a big piece of our logistical system over here, because we cannot communicate enough with our families.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. And just thinking through how this bridge from traditional systems to competency-based systems have these articulated levels. The reporting is much more clear and transparent. The recording of where students are. All of this changes the picture of what's possible and then how it works. And it kind of feeds into the next question from Peter Len, which is, what about handling different amounts of time and practice students need to reach mastery? I think this goes back to the shifts that have to happen in the scheduling, and that flexibility in time actually creates a resource of time for allowing students to dig in. Did you just want to comment also on how you handle different amounts of time and practice that students need?
Yes, actually, the traditional marker in a system is the 4-year graduation rate. And while that's very important if that's when students have mastered their content areas, great. But actually in Westminster, our 5th-year graduation rate is our highest. And I think that speaks to the fact that we're going to meet kids where they are, and as they're ready to level up, we're certainly going to push them. I think in the early days when we said kids are going to learn at their own pace, there was a worry with our families about are we going to let kids sit too long in one spot? And that's certainly not the case. We encourage, we support. Our moniker for our school district is where education is personal. And so each student's personal plan or data notebook, we have those in many, many schools where students are some of our best ambassadors. And they can talk to their data, and they can talk to the parents about making sure that they understand where they are in the learning as well. We also have, we met with college folks registrars in the beginning, because we wanted to make sure that our kids were not going to be at a disadvantage when it came to traditional markers for success as they graduated, or if it was, you know, more than a 4-year rate. And so we actually brought registrars into the room. We developed a transcript so that they would accept that and understand the mastery that each student had. And I'm happy to say our largest high school this year, as another marker for really reaching out and bringing in a number of stakeholders, has really gone a long way, because we have a Future Center, and that Future Center has done terrific work now along with our high school students. And the high school graduation I just attended on Saturday night had a record-breaking $6.5 million worth of scholarships, which is a record for our school district, which tells me that the work we did on the front end with connecting with higher ed, and we continue to do, is really important. The other thing I would say is we have an individual career academic plan for all students beginning at the 6th grade level equivalent. And students need to think about, we call it dream, plan, do, what they're dreaming about in elementary, what they're planning to do in middle school, and what they are doing by the time they reach the high school. And I think that has helped in terms of advanced planning, so that parents and students are not waiting to high school to think about high school, but they're thinking about the day after graduation much, much earlier on.
Great, thank you. There are a couple of questions here related to the important topic of educator professional learning and professional development. How are teachers being supported to help deliver competency-based education? And then Madeline later asked about teacher preparation programs and how teacher preparation programs need to change for competency-based ed. And at CompetencyWorks, we worked on a pretty in-depth publication authored by Catherine Casey just a few months ago called Moving Towards Mastery, and it's focused on what professional learning needs to do to build, sustain, and develop educators for competency-based education. Eliot, I wonder if you'd like to jump in and just talk about, across the field, how are teachers being supported to help deliver competency-based ed? And Dr. Swanson, if you know, you've been doing this for a decade, and educators are absolutely designing and doing the work, how this works in Westminster. Eliot?
Sure. Well, there are a tremendous number of resources available to support teachers in this work, and they cover all of the different types of changes that are needed in order to make these shifts. Just to mention a few of the resources, there's the report that Susan just mentioned, Making Mastery Work. There's several nonprofits whose work is explicitly focused on this. There's a great compilation of resources from different organizations called Learn Next, which you can find through the Two Revolutions website. There's actually even graduate programs now, such as at Southern New Hampshire University, that are specifically focused on preparation for teachers in competency-based models. I'll mention that Learn Next, that I mentioned a minute ago, has whole playlists of resources on a variety of different aspects of making the transition. So you can watch videos on pieces that you want to know more about, or read a very well curated selection of resources. CompetencyWorks has blogs on pretty much any topic related to schools that are making shifts and how they're preparing teachers. So there's a lot of resources. And Dr. Swanson, would you like to talk about some of the specific initiatives that you've done around professional development in Westminster?
In Westminster, I can tell you early on, we knew that we felt a little bit like pioneers because it was something pretty new. And so we've developed several things internally to assist us as well as working with higher ed partners. One of those is we instituted learning walks. We do every week on Thursday. Various groups of staff get together. We walk through classrooms so that we can really monitor for best practice and also consistency and alignment across our system. And that has been a huge benefit for us, and I think it's helped us really refine a lot of our practices and tackle many of our challenges. Our new teachers are actually contracted 5 extra days. They come in early, and we do something called a New Teacher Institute around competency-based education in our system here. And our Board of Education, they've been true champions, and on our calendar we actually have 9 days of dedicated professional development in the school district, as well as a calendar that supports an early release for individual schools and their staff to be able to work in professional learning communities. And I think at this point in time we have so many veteran teachers who tell us they're never going back to another way of providing education, because I think once you roll your sleeves up and get into this and begin to really refresh that shared vision, so often people really believe in the method and the meaning and the equity and the access behind this system.
Susan, I know we're near the end, but there was one question that I thought you might want to take on for just 1 minute. Someone asked, how can we get this started in Massachusetts? And maybe it gets to the larger question of, what are some of the first things that people can do if they're trying to influence their local community or their state to shift in this direction?
Sure. On the policy work, it really is building those relationships with key policymakers, and I'd love for you to feel free to reach out, and we can help circle back on Massachusetts. My email will be coming up, I think, on the screen, or I'll type it in the chat room for you to reach out directly. We can do an analysis of the policy in your state and make recommendations, as well as reach out to those lawmakers there. And some states feel like they have more flexibility, but there are still really restrictive regulations that tie everything back to seat time and the one-size-fits-all traditional model. So I'd be happy to share back. There was a few other questions that we're not going to have time for, but we'll try to follow up with you. I just wanted to give a last shout out. Someone had described in some detail how their school is trying to shift to competency-based ed, but it's not happening across all of the structures. And that is a very familiar challenge that we see with schools and districts getting started. In the last year, we published a quality book that offers 16 essential design elements for quality that are really in 3 areas: culture, structures, and pedagogy. And you see, if those structures are not addressed when the shifts in pedagogy are being made to competency-based, it can be really frustrating for all of the educators doing the great work. So I point you to that resource, and also just say, with respect to Dr. Swanson's excellent presentation, that she referenced the partners that they had worked with. Partners like Marzano and others can help districts take a holistic approach. But if there are other ways that we can help in specific questions, please know we're here in our nonprofit, iNACOL and CompetencyWorks, to help learn from each other and share best practices. So a final thank you to Dr. Pamela Swanson and Eliot Levine for joining me in this presentation. This is an introductory webinar, and we could go very deep in all of these topics. Please let us know where you are in your journey to competency-based education and how we can connect you to the resources and the people that have been through what you're going through to help make this shift a reality for our youth and for our students. Thank you for joining us today, and I appreciate your time and the great discussion. Thank you, everyone.